As we end the month of February, we are watching a very active weather pattern that could bring a threat of severe weather to the Gulf Coast by our Tuesday. We have all the details next at the Weather Farm. Welcome to the Weather Farm and the start of meteorological spring. It is March 1st. We have the weather forecast for you that includes a risk of severe weather across the Deep South for our Tuesday. So let's dive right into our details. As we start our Saturday morning, we see that low pressure, that clipper system that brought heavy snow through the Canadian prairie provinces, through the upper Great Lakes on our Friday. It is now over eastern Ontario, moving through Quebec later on our Saturday. It's going to continue to bring a fair amount of snow north of the United States border. Out west, we do see another system making its way onshore to British Columbia. Not an atmospheric river. There's not a lot of moisture with this particular system, but it is going to bring a fair amount of snow and rain to the northwestern coast of British Columbia. Elsewhere across the country, it is quiet weather. We see in the east, we see that trough digging down through the Ohio Valley. We see those blue 500 millibar contour height lines. We see that trough. That's only going to be there for about one day. And we can see that really reflected in our temperatures. We're going to see cooler than normal temperatures from the Great Lakes into the middle Ohio Valley into the northeast. Temperatures here about 5 to 10 degrees below the seasonal norm, but not too terrible for the first day of March. Whereas out west, look at that warmth spreading all the way up into British Columbia and Alberta. We could see temperatures in southern Alberta in the middle 50s, mid 40s stretching into central Alberta. And we see the warmth coming up the west coast as well. Seattle, you could be near 60. Portland, you're in the mid 60s. Through the interior central California valleys, you're going to be warming into the 70s and 80s. And while we're not as warm in the desert southwest as maybe we were earlier in the week, we're still going to see temperatures in the mid 70s to low 80s across the desert southwest. The real warmth and the core of the heat, it's over far southern Texas. Places like Brownsville, Texas, you're going to be at 85 degrees. Most of Texas in the upper 70s to near 80. And that warmth extends all the way over through Florida and down towards Miami. Now, I mentioned that clipper system that was moving out of Ontario into Quebec. It's going to bring about an additional 6 to 10 inches of snow, mainly for Quebec. Now, parts of eastern Ontario, you could see another 2 to 4 inches during your day on Saturday. Maybe 1 inch to 3 inches along northern Maine, up maybe near New Sweden. Turning our attention down to the west coast and actually up north of the border into British Columbia, we could see generally light amount of snow, 2 to 4 centimeters is likely. You get up in those higher elevations, that's where you're going to start to see snow amounts ranging from 10 to 15, possibly 20 centimeters in those highest elevations. And we can see also a scattering of snowfall across far southern Yukon over into the far southwestern parts of the Northwest Territories. But as we wake up on our Sunday morning, that system that moved through Quebec, it's moving offshore now. We see a little more moisture moving onto the California coast and bringing those higher elevation snows to the Sierras. We see a little disturbance across the Four Corners region. That's going to move across the plains as we get towards our Monday, and it's going to bring some light showers, nothing significant or severe, but we're going to continue to watch that. And we see that trough that's in the east that really was digging down, bringing that colder temperatures for the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley on our Saturday. We're beginning to see that retreat as well. We see that too with our highs. The 20s and teens, they're really confined to the Northeast and the northern Great Lakes, northern Michigan, the UP. We're starting to see temperatures warming. Warmth is surging across the Central Plains, 60s all the way up to South Dakota for our Sunday. We do see a little bit cooler weather in the west. That is associated with that system that's bringing the moisture onshore to California, and it is that system that's going to traverse across the United States over the next 48 hours from our Sunday to our Tuesday. But across parts of Texas, you're enjoying another great Sunday. Temperatures are almost a carbon copy of what they were for your Saturday. And speaking of that precipitation, as it moves onshore on the west coast, generally light amounts, generally around 1/4 of an inch of rain can be expected in most areas, and that rainfall is going to extend even into Southern California, where 1/10 or 2/10 of an inch could be possible for our Sunday into Monday morning. And speaking of Monday morning, as we wake up, I talked about that little disturbance moving out of the Four Corners region on our Sunday. It's now made its way over into Arkansas, bringing some light rain to northern Arkansas and southern Missouri. Out ahead of it, we may see a little bit of sprinkles and a light wintry mix across parts of Illinois into Indiana, but we see this ridge building across the central plains. It's extending all the way up into southern Saskatchewan. Off to the east, in the northeast, we see that trough bringing that colder air to places like New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, into Maine. And even out west, we see a little trough digging down into California, bringing unsettled weather to that area. And here we set the stage for our Tuesday. That area of low pressure that was in Nevada and Utah, it is now formed into a deepening low that is centered near the Nebraska-Kansas border. And we can see on the back side of this, we're going to get a tight wind field going with this particular low pressure system. And it's going to spin up a lot of snow from Nebraska through South Dakota as it makes its way east. But already at 7 a.m. Eastern on our Tuesday morning, we are seeing some strong storms from eastern Oklahoma down towards Dallas. And it is going to be this area of the country we are going to keep our eye on for our Tuesday. And we're going to keep our eye on this because the Storm Prediction Center has already issued on 5 days out that there is a 30% chance of severe weather in this area shaded in brown. That stretches from Louisiana through eastern Arkansas, includes the Memphis area, all the way up towards Paducah, Kentucky. Outside of that, there's a 15% chance of severe weather. And I mention this only because this is extremely rare for this to be issued so far in advance. Usually when we're on the forecast at day 4 to day 7, we're looking at trends and where the patterns might set up. You know, we understand they may wobble, and this area will wobble as well. The main thing is there is enough confidence at this point that somewhere in the yellow and brown section on our map that we are going to see severe tornadic weather on our Tuesday into our Wednesday. Now for our Wednesday, the tornado threat lessens, but there's still the threat of severe weather, damaging winds, hail. It's a 15% chance, and that stretches all the way up from Philadelphia down to Tallahassee, Florida. So we're going to watch the entire East Coast on our Wednesday. This is our projected dew points. So we see moisture surging across Texas into Oklahoma, dew points in the 60s and 70s. We see those 60s not as far north on our Wednesday, and that's why we think there might be a little bit lesser of a threat because we're not going to have that rich, moist air environment. And here we see our 925 millibar height, and so we want to watch this. Right now, these winds at 925 millibars are generally out of the south. As we go up to the 700 millibar level, those winds are slightly turning to the southwest a little bit. As we look now at the 500 millibar level, we see that these winds are almost west-southwest. And we're going to take one more snapshot. We're going to take it all the way up to the jet stream level at 300 millibars, and we almost get a due west wind with this. And the reason I point this out is with these particular thunderstorms, and this is all at Tuesday, 1 o'clock, we are going to have winds that are going to be changing directions with height. That is going to be one of the factors that we will look for when we are assessing the threat of tornadic thunderstorms. We see that here from the surface up to the jet stream level. Those winds have rotated about 90 degrees. So there's definitely going to be rotation in the atmosphere. Another system we watch is the 850 millibar height. And so when we start to see these winds, we start to look for these reds. That indicates the presence of a lower level jet. And so when we look at the 850 millibar map, we are going to start looking for these reds. The reds would indicate winds in excess of 50 knots, the presence of a lower level jet. And where the lower level jet lines up along the dry line, that also can enhance rotation and moisture return into the system. And we also see the red expanding, which is a signal that this lower level jet is going to get stronger during the day Tuesday into our Wednesday. And that stronger lower level jet is going to provide the ability for these storms to be long-lived. Here we're going to look at a skew-T analysis, and this is taken from an area near Tyler, Texas, around 10 a.m. on Tuesday morning. We see temperatures at the surface with this red line about 670 degrees. The dew point's very high in the upper 60s at 67. We see a deeply saturated layer up to about 800 millibars or so. There's a little bit of a dry intrusion up above 800 millibars, but nothing too significant as it's deeply saturated all the way up to the 250 millibar level. We look over here to the right and we see this LCL. This LCL is the lifted condensation level. It tells us when an air parcel is lifted from the surface, at what level does it become saturated? Where do the clouds begin to form? And we see this very low. We see it about a half of a kilometer, or about 1,500 to 2,000 feet above the surface. And that's another ingredient that helps in the development of tornadic thunderstorms, because the lower the clouds are, the smaller the distance that rotation has to make its way down to the surface in developing a tornado. We're also going to look here at these CAPE values. They're generally around 1,000. The mixed layer CAPE at 853, the most unstable at 928. That's pretty juicy air. The convective inhibition, -9, it's not going to take a lot for these storms to start firing. And so then we start to come over here in the second section and we look at the SRH, or the storm relative helicities. And when we look at these storm relative helicities, we are looking for things like values over 200. When we see the storm relative helicities over 200, then that's an indication that there is enough rotation in the storm. So these storm relative helicity values, as high as they are another indicator that rotation and rotating storms are possible if these line of storms remain as discrete supercells. If they form into a long congealed line or a mesoconvective system, that's going to weaken the tornado threat, but it's going to increase the severe weather threat of strong winds and damaging hail. There is a lot of shear with this particular system. And so when we see moderate shear values, 40s, 50s, even approaching 60, that is an indication strong winds, hail is likely. As we start approaching the surface, the 6 kilometer shear at 72, that's strong shear. That's why we think supercells, tornadoes, and organized, long-lived storms are possible on our Tuesday. We look over here at the hodograph. We see that it rotates with height. We saw that on the surface on the wind maps as well. So it kind of makes a curly Q and keeps rotating. All indications that tornadic thunderstorms are likely. And in terms of precipitation, where it rains across the south, you're going to see heavy rain, 1 to 2 inches likely in those purple areas. If you start getting into those reds and oranges, that's 2 to 4 inches. And in terms of snowfall, on the backside, we're not going to talk too much about this because it is about the severe weather, but on the backside through Nebraska, South Dakota, into Minnesota, we could see a few inches of snow as well. But by Thursday morning, we could see some decent snows across the Central Plains. And I mentioned this was a big pivotal storm that we're watching on Tuesday. We see it exiting, and right behind it, we're watching another blast of cold air and a potential storm through the Ohio and Tennessee valleys for next weekend. But watch out west. We see that ridging. It starts to move towards the Central Plains by the 10th and 11th as we see a trough digging off the coast, moving onshore. And then the ridge expands over the eastern half of the United States, and it's the western half of the United States that remains in that colder pattern, with storms going from the Four Corners region up to Minnesota. This is a different pattern change than what we have seen most of the meteorological winter. So as we get towards the 10th, the 11th, the 12th of March, we see a big shift happening. And it's this storm on Tuesday and the one potentially next weekend that's going to really help flip the script for the United States, bring unseasonably warm temperatures across the eastern half of the United States, while the west is cold, snowy, and rainy for the middle parts of March. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this video. Go ahead and drop down in the comments section. Let us know where you're watching from. What preparations are you making for the storms that are coming this week? We will have another video out probably on Monday morning. That'll give us a little more fine tuning on the severe threat for our Tuesday. Stay tuned to us, and we hope to see you again at the Weather Farm.